All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Gentrification and Houselessness webinar. We are at the UCSD Cross Cultural Center. I want to give a disclaimer about the closed captioning. We are using closed captioning on Google Slides, and sometimes it may not capture everything that we say accurately, but before we begin the webinar, we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. UCSD resides on unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. The UCSD community holds great respect for the land and the indigenous people that have first resided where we are currently located. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that the Kumeyaay people continue to have political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge and continue to amplify and uplift the Kumeyaay Nation for their contributions to the UCSD community and the greater San Diego community. And this was adopted from the UCSD Intertribal Resource Center. We're going to start off with some introductions. So my name is Leslie Santiago Ruiz. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a social justice educator as well as an outreach and engagement intern here at the Cross Cultural Center. And I am double majoring in public health and ethnic studies.
Hi, my name is Risa. I use she, her pronouns. I am also a social justice educator and outreach and engagement intern, and I am a second year majoring in political science with a focus on public law.
Hello, my name is Sulema Villa. I go by the gender pronoun she, her, hers. I am a social justice educator and another one of the outreach and engagement interns. I am a third year majoring in public health with a minor in global health. Before we begin the presentation, I want to give a brief introduction of the topics we'll be going over today. First, I'll be defining some key words such as gentrification and language around housing. Second, we'll be going over the history of gentrification, such as how discrimination housing policies of the past have shaped cities today. Next, I'll be going over some examples of gentrification today in the San Diego and California that you may be familiar with. And lastly, we'll be sharing some resources in the UCSD and the broader San Diego area for y'all to get involved and learn more about the topic.
So first, we wanted to ask y'all a question, which is, are you familiar with gentrification? I wasn't super familiar with gentrification before learning about it for this presentation. I knew a little bit of background and I'd seen it a little bit in where I grew up, but I've definitely learned a lot more about it recently, and it's super interesting to see all the impacts that it can have.
For myself, I grew up in a city that got gentrified in the Los Angeles area. Maybe some of you may be familiar with it, the San Fernando Valley, and this presentation helped me learn more about it than I ever knew, even though I lived with it.
Same here. I'm familiar with gentrification because my neighborhood underwent gentrification and actually I ended up getting displaced as a result of it. So this presentation really hit home for me, and it was really nice to be able to do all this research and share this with y'all.
A couple people are responding in the chat. Some people have said yes, they've discussed it in class or have grown up in areas that have been gentrified over the last 10 to 15 years. Absolutely.
Before we begin the presentation, I want to give a reminder about the correct language to use throughout this presentation. We want to avoid using the term homeless person since it is a normalized term that has been used to blame and demonize a person for the housing situation. Instead, we want to use the term a person experiencing houselessness. Next, I'll be going over some definitions that we'll be using throughout the presentation. First, gentrification, the profit-driven race and class change of historically under-resourced neighborhood. Housing, having a private space of residence where you can feel safe and secure. Housing insecurity, the lack of secure individual shelter that results from high housing costs, poor housing quality, unstable neighborhoods, overcrowding, etc. Redlining, the systematic denial of housing and services on a base of race and class. Next, houselessness, the state of being unhoused and having no shelter nor place of residence. Under-resourced neighborhood, neighborhoods that have not been provided with sufficient or adequate resources for one's survival or well-being. And lastly, housing equity, providing all folks with access to affordable and safe housing. Next, I'll be talking about the process of gentrification and its steps. The first step is called profitable development. Here we have under-resourced and urban neighborhoods with prior disinvestment, creating opportunities for profitable redevelopment. Usually these communities consist of minority and ethnic groups of low income, such as Hispanic and Black. Usually these people occupy housing which has a potential to be gentrified. However, they are economically and politically powerless against gentrifiers. Next, we move on to pioneer gentrifiers. These are a small group of risk oblivious pioneer individuals who come in, buy and renovate the area. And usually these individuals have the time, money, and skills to renovate these areas. And they usually do this for their own personal use, and we see little displacement taking place in this step. Next, we move on to gentrifier followers. Here we have larger groups coming in, buying and renovating the area. Here we see some promotional activities taking place, such as changing the name of the city or the borders of it to make it look more enticing to real estate agents and bringing in more attention to the area. Here we move on to media attention. We see the area now gaining more attention from the public due to the alterations that have taken place in the area. We see from the increase of work done by individual investors and new developers that the area has become visibly different from the original one. Here we see the houses no longer matching the new architecture and housing taking place in the area. We see more displacement taking place, and we see tension arise between the pioneer individuals and the new gentrifiers. Next, we move on to large-scale gentrification. We have seen the better maintained properties become part of the middle-class market as landlords seek to take advantage of the enhanced reputation of the area. We also see an influx of middle-class individuals moving into the area due to the prior media attention and investment that has been placed in the area. Due to the larger amounts of middle-class individuals and the renters taking advantage of the new reputation of the area, we start to see rent increase, and the individual people who live in the area are now struggling to pay rent, and the shops in the area are now also increasing their prices. This creates a difficult environment for the original people of the neighborhood to continue living there, and large displacement is taking place at this point. And lastly, we move on to the final step, displacement. At this point, multiple properties have become gentrified in the neighborhood, and this increases to more increase in rent prices, along with adding on to even more displacement. We see the original people of the neighborhood now struggling to pay the rent or having to move out of the area. As I said before, these people had no power economically and politically against gentrifiers. Since what I just shared about the process of gentrification is a lot to digest, I'm going to highlight some of the key points I talked about. The first step being profitable development. Here we see under-resourced and urban neighborhoods with prior disinvestment become opportunities for profitable redevelopment. Usually these communities consist of minority and ethnic groups of low income, such as Black and Hispanic communities. Usually these people occupy areas which have the potential to be gentrified. However, they are economically and politically powerless against gentrifiers. Next, we move on to pioneer gentrifiers. Here we have the first group of people, such as a small group of risk-oblivious pioneers coming in and renovating the area. And these people have the time, skill, and money to be renovating these areas, and we see little displacement going on here. Next, we move on to publicity. Due to the small group of risk-oblivious pioneers, this attracts more attention to the area, and we see larger groups coming in to buy and renovate the area. At this point, we are seeing the neighborhood change from the original one, with more modern housing and architecture taking place, and we see more estate agents coming in and advertising this area. At this point, the original neighborhood is different. And lastly, we move on to displacement. At this point, the original neighborhood has become gentrified and the rent prices have increased, leading the original members of the community having to move out or forcibly removed due to no longer being able to afford the original rent.
I will now be talking about discrimination and housing policies and how these policies have shaped the cities that we see today. To start off, in the late 1800s, there was the enforcement of the Black Codes, and the Black Codes were laws that were meant to restrict the freedom of Black folks in order to keep them available as a cheap labor force after the abolishment of slavery. And one of the things that the Black Codes did was deny home ownership to Black folks. And this made it very hard for them to find stable housing. And as a result, it made it very difficult for them to accumulate intergenerational wealth. At this time, we also saw heavy segregation. Segregation also largely influenced the ways that neighborhoods were built because there were certain spaces allocated for Black people and certain spaces allocated for white people and certain spaces allocated for other people of color. People were already starting to self-segregate because of this. The Standard State Zoning Enabling Act of 1922 actually further legitimized the segregation that we saw in many neighborhoods. This act enabled zoning regulations, and zoning regulations essentially give power to the government to regulate the location of buildings as well as the location of houses and how many occupants can live where. This act became very discriminatory, and many people use these zoning ordinances to racially segregate the neighborhoods. In addition to this, we saw the National Housing Act of 1934 pass. This act was made for the purpose of providing low-income folks with the ability to afford homes through providing them with loans and low interest rates. And while this does sound good in theory, it actually further worked to legitimize housing segregation because it allowed for the creation of residential security maps or redlining maps. I'll go more in depth about what redlining is in the next slide, but for now, redlining maps are created for the purpose of making it difficult for certain folks to get access to loans to buy homes. Another bill that was introduced that further legitimized housing segregation was the Servicemen's Readjustment Bill, or the GI Bill of 1944. And this bill was introduced to give veterans from World War II benefits to get housing a little easier. And some of the benefits included low interest mortgage rates. However, these benefits were not distributed equally. It did not include Black veterans because the Veterans Administration was adhering to what the National Housing Act was saying. And as I just said earlier, they were not allowing Black folks to get access to loans. And as a result, this forced many Black folks to move into impoverished neighborhoods, and it made it very difficult for them to find stable housing, which only increased their chances of becoming unhoused. Redlining made neighborhoods racial projects. Redlining is the systemic denial of housing and services on a basis of race and class. The way that banks decided who had access to what loans was through referring to these redlining maps. I've included a redlining map here of San Diego on the right, and this is a redlining map that was created in 1934. This is a modernized version of it, but it still mirrors what was drawn out before. And to kind of like locate yourselves, so on the top left, we see a cluster of green and blue areas, and this is La Jolla. And if we turn our attention to the bottom right, we see a cluster of red areas, and this is downtown San Diego. So maps were outlined with different colors. Green meant that that area was really good and it was worth investing in. Blue areas were seen as a place that was still desirable and still worth investing in. The yellow areas were seen as definitely declining, so it maybe was not worth investing as much money into because to them, it would not be worth it. And red areas were characterized as risky, really risky for investment. So not a lot of people were able to get loans to buy homes there or renovate those places there. And these maps reflected the population that was in that area. Those who resided in red areas were mainly people of color, as opposed to those who resided in blue and green areas were mainly white people. The United States used these maps to deny loans to people, and mainly people of color in urban areas. And they also prevented them from buying homes and renovating homes to make the area a little bit better. And this is why we still see the same concentration of the same people in these areas. And this is why we still see the large disinvestment of these communities. The Fair Housing Act outlawed these practices, but this was not well regulated. And it is because of this that our maps today still mirror that of what was created in the 1930s. And if y'all don't know, downtown San Diego is actually still has a large unhoused population, as opposed to places like La Jolla, where we see our university reside on. And this kind of goes to reflect what was on these maps. Because if you think about it, like, why was UCSD chosen to be built on the land that it is on? But when you look at the map, this redlining map, you can kind of see why. And yes, these redlining maps barred Black, Indigenous, and other people of color from getting loans for these homes. And white flight only worked to further segregate these neighborhoods. White flight refers to the mass migration of white people from cities to suburbs as more folks of color moved into the cities. So when cities integrated, white folks emigrated. And white flight caused a drainage of resources from these communities, which only furthered the segregation and the disinvestment that was happening. The link between gentrification and houselessness. Gentrification leads to higher rates of people experiencing houselessness, and this is largely because when neighborhoods are made to look more attractive, the rent prices increases and the mortgage rates increase, which consequently push people into insecure housing situations. And typically these folks are left houseless. In California, we have one of the largest population of unhoused people. We currently have around 568,000 people who are unhoused, and with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color experiencing them at the highest rates. If you turn your attention to the graph on the top right, we can see that Pacific Islanders, Black folks, and Native Americans experience houselessness at greater rates than other races and ethnicities. A statistic that I found interesting is that 59% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. With living paycheck to paycheck, as well as having to accommodate for high housing prices, it is very difficult for them to save money and get themselves out of the situation that they're in. And this consequently makes it very easy for them to fall into a cycle of houselessness. And there are emergency shelters and transitional programs that do help provide housing in the short term. However, we don't see enough support for finding permanent housing in the long term. And we don't see as much affordable housing available, which again makes it very easy for many people who are living paycheck to fall into a cycle of houselessness. Many people play a role in gentrification, some of them being universities, sports teams, companies, the wealthy, the city, and lawmakers. For universities and sports stadiums, they need land to reside on. And this is usually a lot of land. I mean, if you look at UCSD, I believe it's one of the largest UC campuses out of all of them. And in order to get land like that for, say, a university or a sports team or a sports stadium, you need a lot of it. And you get that through displacing people, through displacing homes and getting rid of what was there once before. And they largely contribute to the displacement and the attraction of the area. Because when universities and stadiums are installed in certain areas, they're made to look more attractive and they increase the property value, which brings in influx of middle and upper class individuals that consequently push folks who are low income out. Companies, the wealthy, the city, and lawmakers all allow this to happen. They all have power, they all have a say, and they have a lot of political power. So they have a say over who gets to go where. And most of the time they do allow these things to happen because of the fact that it does increase the property value and bring more income to them. Here are some impacts of gentrification that we discussed. There is gentrification causes a rise in rental and housing prices. It causes a disinvestment in communities. It causes houselessness and insecure housing. It makes it difficult for folks to gain generational wealth, and it causes food insecurity. Here are some other important impacts of gentrification that we did not go in depth about, but we still wanted to touch upon. Gentrification can cause less educational and job opportunities. It can increase the exposure to environmental hazards, and it makes less access to transportation methods, and it causes less racial diversity. With less access to transportation, this happens because of the fact that gentrification makes places more industrialized and brings in a lot of car culture, which makes it difficult for someone who doesn't have access to a car to transport themselves from point A to point B. And as a result of the increase of car culture, we see the exposure to environmental hazards, and as a result, like the pollution that comes about from that. We are now going to watch a short 2.5-minute video titled Former Oak Park resident explains how he was displaced by gentrification.
I mean, I grew up in Oak Park. My grandma was in Oak Park, and it was home. I've got one foot. It used to be where we could be in Oak Park and live in a home for $700, $800, you know, and then once folks purchased these homes again, you know, it was $1,000, then it was $1,300, then it was $1,500, and it just we kept seeing these rent increases.
Victor says at one point, he and his 2 siblings all shared a home.
And then once we got to the point where we couldn't afford to live in the space anymore, I stayed in Oak Park for a while.
The first morning you woke up and you were not inside of a house, what was that like?
It was shocking. How did I get here? What do I do now? Where am I going to go to the bathroom? What am I going to do today? How am I going to get out of this situation? Where am I going to sleep?
Victor says he knows of several other people with stories just like his.
People who have children and people who are sleeping in cars, and, you know, not people who, and these are people who are working. You know, these are people who sometimes work 2 or 3 jobs who return to a car to sleep in.
Numbers from Sacramento Steps Forward, a local nonprofit, show there was a 19% increase in homelessness in Sacramento County alone. The study came out in June of last year. Victor says there is a link, and Tanya Faison, a community activist, agrees. She says Black Lives Matter has been fighting Oak Park gentrification for years.
Redevelopment is great if that's all it is, but when it's displacing people, then that's when it becomes a problem, and it's been going on in Oak Park for like a decade now.
Tanya says the impact is different for everyone, but the formula is basically the same.
The owner of the property is like, you have to move, and they don't have to give them a reason, and so they get 60 days to move, and they can't find anything affordable now because everything is just so expensive in Oak Park right now.
All right, so we talked to community organizers who say they do have low-income housing in Oak Park, but they admit that they need more. Now, there's a lot of layers when it comes to gentrification. You can find the other angles I've covered on our website, abc10.com.
All right, so we wanted to ask what your initial thoughts were about this video. How did this video make you feel? When I first watched this video, I remember really appreciating the personal story that was given by the man in the video, because I think oftentimes it's easy to depersonalize these sorts of situations and remove yourself from them if you're not impacted. And so this was very impactful for me the first time that I watched it, hearing the story and hearing a firsthand account of this person.
Same. When I first saw this video, I could relate because, as I stated earlier, I was displaced as a result of gentrification, and it's like you don't really see it coming. And as the guy made a point that he made was that some people who are houseless are working like 2 to 3 jobs still, and they're still not able to afford housing. And that was very much the situation that my family was in as well. And it wasn't until we were displaced that we realized the severity of the problem that was happening.
Someone in the chat said it was very moving. The firsthand account makes people think about the situation happening to them. And for this person, that was the case and brought the problem to light for them, especially since it's not one that many people know about. Absolutely. Someone else said it was really interesting to hear about the way that the man felt the first time he woke up in a park, because I never really think about how it must be to go from having shelter one day to not having shelter the next. Absolutely. I think that firsthand account was very moving.
All right, I did want to talk about how affordable housing is currently in San Diego. Average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment that's 876 square feet in San Diego is approximately $2,433. I've included a visual of what an apartment that is 853 square feet looks like on the bottom right. This is just a random apartment, but kind of to give y'all a visual as to what this average rent can get you in San Diego. Much of the housing in San Diego is less is over $2,000. Actually, 73% of it is over $2,000, with only less than 1% of it being less than $1,000, which means less than 1% of housing is somewhat affordable. And you can imagine with someone living paycheck to paycheck or working multiple jobs, like that rent makes it very difficult for them to get out of the situation that they're in. Focusing in on La Jolla, the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment here in La Jolla that is 853 square feet is $2,750. This rent has only been on a steady increase. If you draw your attention to the graph on the bottom left, we see that there was a decline in rent in March of 2020, but after, in July, it started increasing steadily again. And then we saw another spike in rent occur in 2021. And this correlates to the housing crisis that we see today. We did want to address UCSD's housing crisis that comes as a result of many factors, one of them being the increasing rate of rent that we just saw. For years, UCSD has been increasing enrollment faster than it has been able to add housing. The pandemic protocols have only further reduced the amount of beds that have been available. The pandemic protocols actually eliminated around 2,074 beds. This means that there are 2,074 students that had to look for housing on their own in a housing crisis. In addition to this, UCSD eliminated the housing guarantee for thousands of students. They replaced the 2-year housing guarantee with the priority system, and this resulted in a housing shortage. So students were just tossed into a pricing and competitive rental market. And keep in mind that most of these students are from the ages of 18 to 22, and they were already thrown into a situation where it was very difficult for them to find affordable housing in a very expensive city. And as a result of this, we saw many students left houseless. UCSD did offer the option to live at a hotel at a discounted rate. However, when you look at the price of it, for a double, it would be about $1,785 per month. And this is not even for a full house. This is for a room. Many students still thought this was very unaffordable, so some were opting in to live in their cars. Meanwhile, they were able to find some type of stable housing here. But even when you think about the parking, how much it costs, it's around $346.50 per quarter, which is still largely unaffordable for many students, given the fact that they would be living in their car with no access to amenities. And this only exacerbated the housing crisis. It's been something that's very relevant right now.
We wanted to ask another check-in question. So have you or someone you know been impacted by the housing crisis at UCSD? And someone put in the chat a little bit earlier that high rent prices are something they struggle with because of that they commute, which is tough since they work 2 jobs and campus housing wasn't available. Absolutely. It's been really a struggle for students. And I have multiple friends who've had to find housing really far away because they just can't afford the housing that's in La Jolla or don't have access to on-campus housing.
Same here. I know a few people who have been struggling to find stable housing. Luckily, they were able to find it, but it was a large struggle. And I know some students who are second years and it's their first year on campus and they were not guaranteed a place on campus, which means they had to find somewhere outside and had to commute. So they never got that experience of being able to live on campus. And it's just, yeah.
Other people said, I work full-time and I'm a full-time student and still struggle. Someone else's friend wasn't able to find housing until 2 weeks after school started, which is pretty significant. Other people have multiple friends commuting as a result of the housing crisis, commuting from really far away. Someone else has a friend who can't find affordable housing in San Diego and couldn't afford discounted hotel prices. So again, they commute. This person travels from LA multiple times a week to attend classes, which is a very long commute, especially with traffic and everything. Someone else asked, UCSD is aware of the housing shortage. Is there anything being planned to fix the issue that any of you are aware of?
I personally am not aware of anything that they're planning on doing besides them offering hotels at a discounted rate, which, as someone stated, is still really expensive, unaffordable. Someone said that fortunately they were not impacted by the housing crisis, but to afford their apartment, they have about 6 people in an apartment that traditionally holds 3 to 4 people. And that's the case with a lot of students. Yeah, that's the case for me as well. I'm also in an apartment that is pretty expensive. It's like around $2,500-ish for the rent, and it is currently housing about 5 people, and it's really only meant to house about 3 or 4.
I like to share my own situation with the housing crisis at UCSD. I was struggling to find housing for 6 months and barely was able to find one. And even then, I still have friends who were searching for the same amount as me and commute for like 2 hours and still want to find a better place, but can't for our upcoming year. Next, I'd like to go over some examples of gentrification today in California and some in the San Diego area that some of you may already be familiar with. The first one will be Charles Ravine and the Dodgers. So some of you already may be familiar with Dodger Stadium. However, before it was known as Dodger Stadium, it was called Charles Ravine, which was home to the growing Latinx population in East Los Angeles. This area was home to about 1,500 families who were of low socioeconomic status, and this community was considered a disinvestment and a slump that was ready to be redeveloped. So when Mayor Norris Paulson took office, he decided to offer this piece of land to the Brooklyn Dodgers, who were popular at the time, to bring more attention to the UCSD area, to the Los Angeles area, and bring in more housing. The Brooklyn Dodgers accepted this offer, and any families that were in the area were asked to take a cash incentive and leave. However, if they did not leave by the deadline, they were forcibly removed and their houses were bulldozed to make way for Dodger Stadium. On the pictures on the right side, you can see one of the community members being forcibly removed from the area and the process of building Dodger Stadium. Another example of gentrification in East Los Angeles is Boyle Heights and with the University of Southern California. Some of you already may be familiar with this one too. The University of Southern California, or also known as USC, has a legacy of gentrification tied to its name. The university is planning on expanding its health science campus building into Boyle Heights and along with expanding their housing for graduate students. They plan to accomplish a 25 to 30-year master plan. However, by accomplishing this, they will disrupt the neighborhood of Boyle Heights. This has led Boyle Heights to be fearful of being priced out, displaced, and forced to move out of their original neighborhood because the rent will most likely increase from USC, since it is a private university and well-known, that will most likely displace them. Although USC has stated that they're working with the community to keep their opinions in mind and avoid this situation, community members have publicly spoken out and said that USC is not doing this, and in reality, they're fearful of being displaced and their rent prices are already changing. And the photo on the right side shows a picture of Boyle Heights, and you can already see the gentrification behind it with just the Los Angeles community in general. Next, I want to tie back gentrification to the San Diego area. Some of you already may be familiar with Barrio Logan. Barrio Logan already has fallen victim to gentrification before, but right now I'm going to be highlighting the Bodega Gallery. In 2019, the Bodega Gallery located in Barrio Logan fell victim to the increase of gentrification in the city. The couple, Sonia Lopez Chavez and Chris Cerruche, ran the Bodega Gallery starting in 2013. And although this couple had a great passion to share their art and brought in large crowds of people, this led their renter to increase their rent by 4 times the amount. And this led them to have to shut down their gallery and leave Barrio Logan. This situation highlights the ongoing situation that has become normalized of Chicano art galleries being pushed out because of gentrification and having to be shut down. The photos on the right side are just a couple of the signature pieces that you can see in Barrio Logan that some of you may recognize. Another example of gentrification in San Diego is with City Heights. City Heights is one of the most ethnically diverse neighborhoods in San Diego. However, recent changes in the community and their housing, rent, and the overall visible community has led community members to be fearful of gentrification, specifically with cultural diversity and displacement of many ethnic families. Even though City Heights hasn't experienced extreme gentrification, such as Barrio Logan, the recent statistics of the area has led community members to be fearful. For example, the median household income rose from $23,681 in 2000 to $30,549 in 2010. And out of 81,000 residents, 77% are renters, and 61 of those renters spend 30% of their income on rent. These statistics have led the community to be fearful of gentrification as time continues.
So for another check-in question, have you or someone you know been impacted by gentrification? And if so, how?
For me, I've mentioned it before already, but I have been directly impacted by gentrification, and it just sucks, like seeing my community that I once lived in get turned into something that's completely different. And every time I go back and visit, it's like it does not look the same. It's not the community that I knew. So it just doesn't feel like home anymore, which really sucks because I had a lot of, like, I grew up there, so yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Portland, Oregon, and there's a lot of gentrification happening there right now. Going back even this past Thanksgiving break, it was really wild to see how much has changed. And there's always new apartment complexes being put up, but there's still the same number of unhoused people in the neighborhood. And it's clear that these new apartment complexes that are being built are a result of gentrification, that they aren't being used for affordable housing, even though that could be a great opportunity to help the housing crisis.
Myself, as I mentioned, I live in the Los Angeles area, specifically the outskirts, and I've seen my community, the Los Angeles type of environment, slowly creep into my home, where our groceries have increased in prices. So I'm experienced my own food insecurity, and also I've seen more malls and apartments pop out of nowhere. And it's always shocked me how my simple neighborhood has changed so much in the past 10 years. Next, we want to highlight housing and COVID-19 and what the situation looked like. As some of you already may be familiar with, COVID-19 exposed the existing inequalities in the workforce and in housing insecurity. Here we saw a lot of Hispanic and Black individuals more likely to lose their job and become behind on their rental payments. They were more likely to struggle to regain their jobs than their white counterparts. Moreover, they were likely to become on their rental payments. And as of December 2020, 8.8 million people were behind on their rental payments, and these were mostly composed of Black and Latinx individuals. Next, I'd like to highlight the charts on the right side of the graph. The first one called percent change in number of jobs from February 20 to September 2021. We see that low wage jobs were 5.3% likely to be lost, and usually people who are working these jobs are Latinx and Black individuals, in comparison to high wage jobs, which are only 0.8% likely to lose their jobs. Next, the share of renters that were reported is likely they will be evicted. As of December 2020, nearly twice as many households classified as Hispanic reported it would be likely that they would be evicted than white households, and this was more than double for Black households. And these statistics highlight how much that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted Black and Latinx individuals in the workforce and in housing.
Now we'll be moving on to resources. So what can be done and what can we do to help? Some plausible solutions that we have come up with are creating affordable housing for all incomes. In creating affordable housing for all incomes, we would see neighborhoods that were not just strictly wealthy people, or neighborhoods that are not just strictly low-income people. And again, to recap, this comes as a result of the redlining maps that were created. So these were not these were created intentionally. But if we create affordable housing for all incomes and make it mixed, we'll see different populations in that area, which might lead to a more equitable funding distribution in their neighborhoods. Something else that we can do is create inclusionary zoning policies. Inclusionary zoning policies would require developers to designate a certain percentage of the units that they're building in a given product below the market rate. So this means making them cheaper than the houses around them, making them more affordable. Something else that can be done is implementing rent control. Rent control puts a cap on how much one can change per unit, as well how much one can charge per unit, as well as how much rent can be changed per year and how much it can be increased. And so this basically controls and makes sure that a landlord is not increasing the rent by thousands of dollars at a time, and which would create a stable rent. One of the most important things is involving community. A lot of the time, community members don't know that they're being gentrified until they are displaced. We need to give them a platform and a space to give us their input about the redevelopment of cities and input about the design that is happening in their neighborhoods, as well as educating community members on options that they have, such as updated laws and reconstruction plans. We need to keep them involved in decision-making because, as I said, most of the time they don't know what's happening until they're being displaced. So involving community would make sure that they're involved in the decision-making, and it would just make the neighborhood, it would hopefully lower or eliminate the amount of displacement. I did want to make the distinction between gentrification and revitalization. A lot of the time, folks claim to want to revitalize neighborhoods, but because they're approaching it in a wrong way, they actually end up gentrifying it. Gentrification, to recap, takes advantage of under-resourced neighborhoods for personal profit, and it causes housing to be unaffordable for many low-income families. It completely redesigns neighborhoods and shifts the neighborhood demographic, as well as shuts down many local businesses. And as a result of all of this, we see the displacement of large populations. Revitalization, however, implements opportunities for existing residents to build wealth and social networks. We see local neighborhood services and businesses uplifted within the community. Revitalization provides adequate resources and helps and supports the existing residents that are already there. And revitalization is community driven and builds opportunity for community growth. And as a result of revitalization, we would not see any displacement. Here I've included an example of what gentrification looks like versus what revitalization can look like. On the top left, we see that there is a building that's very much modernized. It's very new. It looks very different than the three houses that are on the left of it. And this is an example of gentrification as it redesigns the property for one's personal use. And as a result of this, we would see the property value increase, and we will probably see the folks who are residing in the other houses be displaced because they can't keep up with the rising rental prices that are being introduced. And on the bottom right, we see an example of the revitalization of vacant lots for community gardens. Instead of using this vacant lot to build a new building, the community used it to build a community garden where they can come together and garden together, build social networks, make friendships, as well as make and grow some organic food, which would address some of the food insecurity that may be happening within this neighborhood. I wanted to plug in the Hub Basic Needs Center. This is a resource that is available on campus. It is located in the original Muir Student Center in Building A, room E100. The Basic Needs Center helps and supports students with financial resources, housing resources, and food security. They also have free food distributions on Wednesdays from 9 to 11 a.m. if y'all are interested. And if y'all want to look at the other times in which they distribute food or just want to look up more information about them, feel free to scan that QR code or type in the tiny URL .com/hubbasicneeds, and you'll be led to information about their center and when you can access their resources. We also wanted to include this holistic resource guide where we provide resources on housing information and services, as well as food security, counseling support, academic support, and more. So feel free to scan the QR code or again, type in that tinyurl.com/holistic resource. And here are some resources that can be found in the greater San Diego community. One of them being Breakfast Block SD, which is a mutual aid that redistributes food supplies to unhoused people here in San Diego. We also have 211 San Diego, which is a confidential and free service for assistance in securing safe housing. We also have Father Joe's Villages, which provides healthcare, job training, mental health support, and housing assistance. And an organization here on campus that works directly with unhoused populations is the Mustard Seed Project, where they direct care packages and aid to unhoused people. And again, if y'all are interested in looking up these organizations or looking into them, feel free to scan that QR code on the bottom right or type in the tinyurl.com/San Diego Orgs.
And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for coming and listening. And if there are any questions, feel free to ask them now in the chat, or you can email us at cccenter@ucsd.edu. We also have our website there, ccc.ucsd.edu. And we're very active on social media, Instagram especially. We're at the UCSD Cross Cultural Center.